Very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Miko Peled, who is an author of many fantastic books, including, I have to say, Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. I want to get that right, because that's a fantastic book, by the way. Also an activist, also just a generally great person. Miko Peled, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Great to be with you guys. Thanks for inviting me.
So, Miko, it's been a pretty intense week, right? Israel has a new government, and that's been all the talk in Western media is Netanyahu's out, let's throw a party. But the people who've taken over are quite frightening figures, the most prominent of which is Naftali Bennett, the new prime minister of Israel, who is a very frightening figure. He's openly boasted that he's killed a lot of Arabs, and there's nothing wrong with that. He's talked about how Palestinians who approach the fence in Gaza should be immediately shot. Anybody who sends a balloon out of Gaza, an incendiary balloon, should be killed. Those aren't children, they're terrorists, and on and on and on. Very pro-settler. He, is, if I'm not mistaken, the leader of a party that is made up of settlers. And then, of course, just a few days after he became prime minister, we saw these, there was this far-right Jerusalem Day rally that was postponed, flags like far-right rally that was postponed about a month ago. And his new coalition let it go forward. And so you had these far-right Jewish supremacists marching through East Jerusalem, chanting death to Arabs, and other really disturbing chants, including they went to Shofat, a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, where people might remember several years ago, a teenage boy named Hamid Abu Khader was kidnapped by a group of Jewish extremists, and he was burned alive. He was lynched. And so this group of people that were these far-right extremists who were marching in recent days were chanting that they want to burn, that this town is burning in a celebratory fashion. And they were chanting for a second Nakba. I mean, really, really just frightening chants, but that have kind of become routine in East Jerusalem. And this just happening a few days after this new government came into power. So I'm just laying out some of the background. What do you make of this new government and these extremists who seem to be even more emboldened?
Well, you pretty much laid it out as it is. I wouldn't eulogize Netanyahu quite yet, because this government is the only reason this government managed to even come into existence is because of one member of Knesset who's a Palestinian abstaining. And that took a lot of work to get him to abstain. And so they got a 60-59 vote, which is not really a majority. And Netanyahu is breathing down the necks of every right-wing politician, and there are lots of them in the Knesset. In fact, there's a majority of them in the Knesset. And I would venture to say that very soon we're going to see him back as prime minister, where all of these guys are working for him in some kind of a national unity government, because they can't function like this. But like, Ali Abu Nima said, they just switched a different executioner. I mean, the policies are the same. In terms of the victims are the same. It's just a different executioner. And really, it's not even a different executioner for very much longer. It's basically a little relief hand for the old guy to, catch his breath. But the situation is severe. I mean, I was just there. I just got back about a week ago. I actually have been to previous, what they call the flag marches during what they call Jerusalem Day. And it is the most frightening scene I've ever seen in my life. I've never seen thousands and thousands of right-wing white supremacists basically running around and chanting death to whoever it may be. In this case, it's death to Arabs. And to see Palestinians in the old city, hurrying up, scurrying to lock up their shops and board them up and run away before these lunatics come is really terrible. I mean, it reminds you of Europe in the 1930s and what Jewish people must have felt. It's really horrifying. But this is the reality. This is Israel. These people are, they try to portray them as somehow extremist Israelis. They are Israelis. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are just the ones who happen to show up because they're younger and maybe a little more excitable. But these are Israelis. I mean, they represent what we see in Israeli politics. And it is frightening to be a Palestinian. Palestinians of 1948 have always been persecuted, have always been, subjected to racism. But they've never been afraid to walk down the streets. They've never been afraid to go to work. Now people in important positions, people work in hospitals, people work in important places, are afraid to go to work with Israelis. Women who wear hijab are afraid to go to work because obviously they're identified as Palestinians and it's dangerous. So like one Palestinian friend said to me, we used to be afraid of the authorities and the police for obvious reasons. Now we're afraid to walk down the streets. We're afraid of other Israelis, and we're afraid of being in the workplace with Israelis. The situation is severe. On the other hand, of course, there's a unity that we saw between Palestinians across Palestine. There's really no more West Bank. It's all a part of the same state, but there are pockets, these ghettos, Palestinian ghettos, within that area that used to be West Bank. There's the Gaza Strip, and then there's the rest of Palestine, Jaffa and Haifa and Ramla and Lid and Naqab in the south. And all Palestinians stood up and resisted together. So that is the new reality that is emerging, and I think Palestinians are going to pay a heavy price before anything good happens. But I think we're well on the way to seeing something dramatically change.
As we're speaking, Miko, I'm seeing there's reports been coming in for the last 30 minutes or so that Israel has been bombing Gaza again. There's supposed to be a ceasefire in place, of course, after last month. Israel spent 10 days, as we all know, bombing Gaza, killed something like 250 people, including, I think, like 60 children. I mean, just crazy, ridiculous numbers. Entire families in their beds. I'm not sure what the details are of the current bombings in Gaza. I don't know if this is an end to the ceasefire or these kinds of occasional outbursts of, punishing Gaza that seem to take place every few days or weeks. But I guess I would ask you, since you did spend time in Israel, Palestine, what was your perception of the response by the Israeli public to the war on Gaza? And are they even still talking about it? Have they completely moved on? Are they still reflecting on it, whether in a positive or negative way? What's your take on that?
I was sitting in Jerusalem, less than 100 kilometers from Gaza, and you sit in the comfort of your home. You sip a cup of coffee. People are going to work. Kids are going to school. People are going out. And less than 100 kilometers from you, Israel is slaughtering civilians in Gaza by dropping these horrible bombs from the air. And at night, everybody watches the news, and Israeli news channels are like, 10 different variations of Fox News. So the narrative is consistent. There is no dissent. There's no dissent at all. And that's what people will consume. They consume the news just as it is. Like I said, Fox News on steroids. And every channel is the same. It's not like there are more progressive channels or channels that you can listen to and somehow find real news. And that's it. They go to bed, they get up in the morning, and everything starts. The segregation and between the sides is not only so deep in terms, so the sides never meet, the Palestinians and Israelis never meet, but it's also so deep in terms of of the information. I have friends in Gaza that I communicate with regularly. People have children. Actually, all of them have children. And they're saying, what more can they bomb? I mean, what else are they going to bomb? I mean, they've ruined everything. The kids are hysterical because their friends have been killed. Next door neighbors have been killed. The situation is so horrifying, and Israelis just, go on about their business. I mean, Tel Aviv, again, is 50 kilometers from Gaza. People are on the beach. Restaurants are full. In Jerusalem, the Mascobia, the infamous prison and torture chambers, are right in the middle of West Jerusalem. There's restaurants and cafes, and people are hanging out all over the place. Nobody cares. Nobody cares that under the ground, a block away, children are screaming from pain and torture. It's a reality that is hard to explain sometimes because it is so horrible and so uncaring. People know, but they don't care. people think it's okay. They think it's not their problem.
Jeez. I mean, it's really frightening because it seems like there's no obstacles standing in the way between this growing Israeli extremism, indifference, hatred for Palestinians, and Palestinians themselves, who seem to be largely, I mean, they're just the international community, because of the US and the EU and all these countries that support Israel, doesn't seem to even have any red lines. There's nothing holding Israel back, it seems like. And that, I think, is what's so most frightening about this, is the only thing holding the Israelis back is what? Like, what is there anything holding them back from just carrying out this like
Well,
eliminationist viewpoint that's just growing and growing and increasingly represented in government?
well, that's exactly the problem. I mean, the Palestinians have no protection. I mean, I have Palestinian friends who are activists. They can be shot tomorrow and nobody cares. There's nobody there to protect them. I'm talking about, many of them are citizens of the state of Israel. And supposedly the citizenship is supposed to give them something, provide them some protection. If they are shot and killed tomorrow, nobody will go to court, nobody will go to jail. There's absolutely no protection. Palestinian children, there's nobody to protect them, whether they're in Gaza or in Jerusalem or anywhere else throughout Palestine, or certainly if they're in refugee camps outside of Palestine. And that's exactly the problem. The only protection they have is us sitting here and talking about this and trying to influence and trying to, broaden the circle of people who know, and trying to disseminate information so people understand better. But really, there's no recourse, there's no protection. And I always say, there's got to be more that we can do. I mean, we do a lot from the outside, but there's got to be a greater push for BDS. There's got to be a greater push particularly for sanctions and boycotting the state of Israel. The Israelis have got to know that they are outcasts. They've got to be isolated. They have to be eliminated from going to the Olympic Games and to other international gatherings, whether they're academic or cultural or whatever. American politicians need to understand that if they claim that they're Zionists, if they continue with their Zionist foreign policy, they will be ousted. People are afraid to be called anti-Semitic. It should be just as bad to be called a Zionist, because Zionism is another form of racism. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism, and Zionism is a form of racism. So people should be embarrassed to call themselves Zionists and to support the state of Israel. That's really, I think, our biggest challenge. That's what we should be doing. We should be pushing the narrative and the discourse to a point that anybody who supports Israel should be embarrassed to do so. Anyone who doesn't call and support the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions should be ousted, should be ashamed to show their face in public. That I believe is the only way that we can protect Palestinians, our Palestinian friends, the activists, the children, and so on. That's the main challenge that we here on the outside have.
Miko, one of our viewers has thrown in a donation in the super chat and left a comment specifically for you. He says, "Thanks, Breakthrough, for having the great Miko Peled on. Miko, thanks for all your work. Love from Nimmer, one of your patron supporters, and welcome back from Jerusalem." So thank you for that comment to the viewer from the viewer, Miko. I'm curious, since you did spend time in Israel, Palestine, and there was this war, obviously, between Hamas and the Israelis. Hamas did manage, interestingly, I think impressively, to lob many, many rockets at Israel, which was surprising just because, this is probably one of the most besieged places in the world, and they still managed to gather whatever they needed to make these rockets and seemed to have like an endless supply. And as a result, it seemed like the Iron Dome became exhausted and they almost ran out of missiles, which may have been one reason why they had to end their airstrikes. And Israelis had to spend several days in bomb shelters. Did this, in the mind, do you think this established any sort of deterrence at all? And I'm curious if there was conversations among Israelis about what this would mean if they ever had a war with Lebanon, because obviously Hezbollah is far more capable in terms of its level of equipment and its capacity to actually do offensive maneuvers, to put up a bigger fight against Israel should a war break out between the two. So I'm just curious about the conversation about deterrence and what this could mean if there was a war with Hezbollah among Israelis.
Well, yeah, they talk about the Hezbollahization of Hamas. And I think there are three things were notable in terms of the accomplishments that the Palestinian resistance has made. One is the Israeli airport was closed; flights couldn't come in. When I booked a flight, when I got to the airport, they told me that it was canceled. Nobody wanted to land in Tel Aviv. I had to go through Jordan to fly to Oman and cross overland. And so the only major airport of the entire state of Israel was closed for at least a week, if not more, if not 10 days. No flights were coming in or leaving. That's one. Number two, Israeli forces, ground forces, were terrified. They try to make it as though they didn't enter ground forces for some kind of strategic reasons and they had some kind of a trick that they played, whatever. I think it's obvious that their experience from 2014 showed that if they enter ground forces, they will have heavy casualties. In 2014, they had some serious casualties, including many high-ranking officers. They know that man-to-man, they're no match for Hezbollah. And I think they're realizing that man or soldier to soldier, they are not a match for Hamas, for Palestinians either, Palestinian fighters either. It's not only Hamas. And so they didn't dare to set foot inside the Gaza Strip. And then the third thing is that, Palestinians are not all supporters of Hamas. But this time around, there was very broad, very widespread support among Palestinians everywhere for the rockets and for Hamas, for the stance that Hamas took in general. And then the fact that Israel was kind of forced to end it, it's kind of silly to say quickly because over 200 people were slaughtered. So it's a terrible thing to say, right. But relatively quickly compared to other times that Israel assaulted Gaza. And I think these three accomplishments are not insignificant. These are we're talking about, like you said, a small, people who live in an open air prison that are completely blocked from the rest of the world. Closing a major airport of a major state with a massive army, and not a single soldier dared to set foot inside the territory of the Gaza Strip. So I think this is quite telling. And there's no question that Israeli authorities understand that they cannot have a head-on confrontation with Hezbollah. They cannot have a head-on confrontation with the Palestinians either, because they will lose.
And, do you think that do you see a significance in the level of, I guess you could call it support, solidarity, like you just mentioned, for Palestinian resistance, but in places, you actually saw people demonstrating inside 48 areas, right? Like you saw Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians in Haifa, Palestinians in Palestinians all across the board, who've been segmented and separated by different ID cards and, walls and all of these different mechanisms Israel's implemented to fracture these people from one another. And in Gaza, do you see a level of significance in this kind of overall solidarity that we saw, an uprising, if you will, that we saw among Palestinians this time around?
Oh, absolutely. They completely demolished all the separations, all the segregation, all the structures, like you said, that Israel put in place to divide Palestinians. They crushed all of them. Palestinians in Jaffa and Lid, and like you said, in the Naqab. I mean, Israel arrested over 3,000 activists from 1948 Palestine, other Palestinian citizens of Israel. Many of them were held. I was at a court in Bir Saba in the Naqab. Many of these young Palestinians were detained after they were beaten up by Israeli mobs. And then what they did was they labeled some of them as security detention, which meant that they could not speak to a lawyer for days and days and days. So in other words, they created another place of unity between Palestinians in areas like, what used to be the West Bank and Jerusalem, and Palestinians of 1948, where they're also considered security detainees, and they received the same kind of treatment and the same kind of torture by the Shabak and so on. I mean, a good friend of mine was released just before I arrived. He's an activist in the south, in the Naqab, and he was held for 3 days in a dungeon underground in Askelan and beaten and tortured. it's incredible to see. But they're not afraid. I mean, the unity was obvious. Even in Jordan, Palestinians were
Yeah.
marching to the border. They were marching to the river. There was a sense that Palestinians are back as a nation, as one, as a unified nation, and they will not adhere by these rules and by these separations and by the different status that the state of Israel has given them. And I think it's important to also note here, people are making a big deal of the fact that there's a small Palestinian faction that agreed to sit in the government, in the coalition, with this sadistic neo-fascist Naftali Bennett. Well, that is not representing the Palestinian. It doesn't represent even their own constituents. Even among their own constituents, they are in big trouble for this, and it doesn't look like it's going to last very long. They are being ousted, and they are being seen as almost as traitors for sitting like this. And so, in other words, that should not mean that there's somehow they represent Palestinians, that they represent Palestinian perspective. Quite the opposite. They are viewed very, very negatively. And the fact that they agreed to sit in this coalition government is seen as a big mistake.
As it should be. Conversely, I'm curious how the sense of unity, especially in the streets of, where you saw Palestinian citizens of Israel actually demonstrating, how this impacted Israelis in terms of their perception of this issue. How did they see that? Did they see that as very threatening? Is there even a conversation about that level of unity in the fact that there was Palestinians protesting across 48 Palestine?
Well, like I said, if you imagine how Fox News would report this, and that's how Israel reports this. So basically now these citizens of Israel, these Palestinians upon whom we bestowed citizenship, and we gave universities, and we developed their homes, and we developed a country, and they are allowed to enjoy all the benefits of being part of our wonderful state, are now coming up against us. Now they're supporting terrorism. They're attacking Jews all over the country. We are fearful of engaging with them because now they've turned against us like a fifth column. That's what is being portrayed. So of course Israelis are terrified that the Palestinian colleagues at a hospital or at a university or wherever the case may be may stab them in the back. Or of course the reality is precisely the opposite. But that's how it's being portrayed. Right. So yes, Israelis are now worried that Palestinians from Al-Fahim or from Nasra or from anywhere else will come up against them. But that's how it's being reported. It's this unbelievable reality, unbelievable sticking your head in the ground to a point of complete absurdity. And the images are obvious. People see the images. People know what happened. The images are not. There's no confusion. We know what is taking place. We see the images of what is taking place in Jerusalem. Who is being the terrorist? Who is provoking? Who is calling death to whom? Who are the thousands and thousands of right-wing, supremacists marching with this ugly flag throughout the city, throughout the alleys of the old city, terrorizing and provoking Palestinians? It's Israelis. But somehow they manage, like I said, like Fox News, they've got this magic trick where they completely change the story.
But the entire media apparatus is like this. There's no, in Israeli society, is there no leftist element? There's no anti-war sentiment? Where it doesn't exist at all? Even in America that exists, right? Where is it in Israel? It's just gone?
Well, there used to be a Zionist peace movement, but you can't have a Zionist peace movement. It's a complete oxymoron, and so it collapsed. And so we see the remnants, which is the Labor Party and the Meretz Party, and they are like sheep following Naftali Bennett and pretending that some great accomplishment has taken place, some great achievement, that they are now sitting in this unity government with a neo-fascist. Because you cannot be a Zionist and talk about peace and equality and all these good things. So obviously there are fringe elements, perhaps like me, who live there and kind of talk the way they talk and go to protests.
Right.
And you have a couple of hundred people maybe who come to Sheikh Jarrah and protest, but it's nominal. It's very small.
So, Miko, we have another super chat fan, Matt, who said, my Jewish friend said there is extremism on both sides, and I had to tread carefully because it's a sensitive subject. So, how do you respond? Like, how would you advise somebody? This guy Matt in particular, he's got a Jewish friend who says there's extremism on both sides. How should Matt respond to that? How do you respond to that? Because that is a common thing you hear, even now, as there's chance of death to Arabs. What's your take on how to deal with that?
Well, if there's extremists on both sides, show me the Palestinian extremists. I've never seen them. I don't know what they're talking about. Who are the Palestinian extremists? Where are they? How are they represented? I mean, I don't know what they're talking about. I mean, who's bombing who? Who's calling death to who? Who's got the F-16s and murdering children? Who's got racist laws? Who's passing racist laws? Who's keeping who in ghettos and in prisons?
That's right.
I mean, who's denying who water? What are they talking about? How can there be extremists on both? How can you even say the word both sides? But where's the Palestinian extremism? Show it to me. I've never seen it. I don't know what they're talking about. It's one of these, bumper sticker claims that's out there, and people, oh yeah, that's right. It's sensitive. There's extremists on both sides. They're both wrong. What are you talking about? Where does this nonsense even come from? I mean, we know where it comes from, but how are you able to substantiate these ridiculous claims? I don't know what extremism on the other side looks like. I've never seen it.
Yeah, and then also, of course, like you mentioned, who's doing what to who? I mean, even if you have Palestinian extremists, which I think maybe every society has some level of, right to left, right? They have no power. Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel has Hellfire missiles. Israel has the backing of the most powerful country in the world, the United States, that arms it to the teeth. Israel has a defensive Iron Dome, right, where it can shoot any threat to it out of the sky for the most part. Israelis have bomb shelters, and they drop bunker buster bombs on, family homes and kill entire families in their beds. So yeah, it's a really shocking thing that people say both sides, but at the same time, that's what they're inundated with the media, I suppose. Eugene, I'm sure
it's
you're
like the self-defense.
itching to get it. Oh, go ahead.
I'm just saying, it's like the self-defense claim. Israel has a right to self-defense. But wait a minute. The Palestinians are the ones who have the right to self-defense because they're the ones who are being attacked. But when they try to defend themselves, they're terrorists. It's these bumper sticker statements that Zionists put out there.
Mm-hmm. No, well, I'm only itching to hear more from Miko Peled, but if we're not careful, we'll keep you here for the rest of the night into tomorrow. As always, Miko, I appreciate everything that you bring to the table, and I really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side and giving us some of your time and illuminating analysis.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
No, thank you.